If the rain could speak, it would tell you exactly when a life stops and when it refuses to. Emily Carter had always believed storms were just weather, nothing more. Yet that night the sky over Blackwood Ridge felt different, heavier, as if the clouds themselves were pressing down on the earth to hide something it did not want found. She moved carefully along the muddy edge of the forest trail, her boots sinking slightly into wet soil as she returned from gathering medicinal herbs near the riverbed. The scent of pine crushed under rainwater filling her lungs with every breath. Emily was an Omega, but not the kind anyone in the nearby packs ever respected or noticed. Her name rarely spoken except in passing judgment, her existence treated like background noise in a world that valued strength and dominance above all else. Yet she had learned long ago that silence could be its own kind of survival. A sudden sound cut through the rhythm of rainfall, low and uneven, like breath struggling against the weight of exhaustion, and she froze, turning slowly toward the dark line of trees where the river curved out of sight. For a moment, there was only rain, but then she saw him, half submerged near the shallow bank where water rushed faster than it should have, a man lying still as though the world had forgotten him there. Emily's instincts told her to stay back, to leave before trouble found her name again. But something in her chest tightened, an unfamiliar pull that felt less like fear and more like recognition. As if the storm itself was guiding her forward, she stepped carefully down the slick slope, kneeling beside him, her fingers hovering just above his shoulder before she dared to touch, feeling an unnatural warmth beneath the cold rain. His breathing shallow but present, his features obscured by wet, dark hair clinging to his face. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her voice barely rose above the rain, yet the man did not respond, only shifting faintly as if caught between worlds. Emily hesitated, glancing back toward the tree line where distant lanterns from patrol hunters occasionally flickered through the storm. She knew the rules of these lands, knew that strangers found at the border often came with consequences she could not afford. But leaving him felt heavier than staying. With careful effort, she slid her arms beneath his shoulders, surprised by his weight, and began dragging him toward higher ground, her boots slipping but refusing to stop until they reached the small wooden cabin she called home at the edge of the woods. Inside, the warmth of a dying hearth welcomed them, and she laid him near the fire, watching as droplets of rain gathered beneath him like scattered stars. For the first time, she noticed something strange. His presence did not feel empty, even unconscious. It felt contained, as though something inside him was holding back an entire world. Emily reached for a cloth to dry his face, unaware that far beyond the storm, something within the forest had already begun to shift, as if recognizing that the night had just chosen its turning point. Emily Carter sat beside the small hearth, the faint warmth brushing her hands as she adjusted the wet blankets around the man she had rescued, her eyes studying the way his chest rose and fell with steady breaths, each exhale a rhythm of life that seemed impossibly delicate yet unyielding. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, tapping against the cabin roof like a soft percussion, and in the quiet, the forest felt alive, holding its breath alongside her, as if aware that something significant was unfolding within these walls. She poured a small cup of water and brought it to his lips, whispering words of encouragement, careful not to startle him, noting how even the faintest movement of his eyelids suggested consciousness struggling to surface from beneath the weight of exhaustion and uncertainty. Emily remembered her grandmother's teachings about the hidden strengths that every being carried, a lesson learned in years of tending to both people and animals alike, and she could not help but sense that he was no ordinary man, that beneath the stillness and the shivering form lay a force restrained, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She moved with deliberate care, brushing rain-soaked hair from his face and adjusting his position to ensure he was comfortable, her own pulse synchronizing with the gentle rhythm of the room, a quiet connection forming in silence that required no words. The wind shifted outside, carrying with it the scent of wet pine and the crisp promise of dawn, and Emily felt an unexpected calm in her chest, a conviction that she had made the right choice in bringing him here despite the isolation and potential danger. Hours passed with only the flickering fire and the occasional drip of water from the roof to mark time, and she found herself studying subtle details, The way his fingers twitched with effort, the faint glimmer of strength in his eyes when they fluttered open for a brief moment. The way his breath adjusted as if he were sensing her presence and responding in some unspoken language. Emily spoke softly, recounting stories of the forest, the pack, and the herbs she had collected, weaving a narrative that seemed to coax him further toward awareness. Her voice steady yet infused with a warmth that felt almost tangible, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of safety. She noticed, without fully understanding how, that the more she focused on tending to him, the more the room seemed to shift in energy, the light from the hearth reflecting differently across the walls, the shadows dancing with a sense of anticipation rather than mere flicker, as though the space itself acknowledged the presence of something extraordinary hidden within the man before her. Time became fluid, measured not in minutes or hours but in breaths and the gradual awakening of recognition. And Emily sensed a subtle tension in the air, a readiness, a promise that whatever force lay dormant would soon respond to the care and attention she offered. Finally, as the first pale light of morning filtered through the narrow cabin window, catching droplets of water still clinging to the wooden frame, the man stirred more deliberately, a deep intake of breath signaling awareness, and Emily, still seated beside him, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, knowing that this was the moment when the quiet bond formed through shared stillness and gentle attention might begin to reveal the truth that neither of them yet fully understood. The first light of morning stretched across the wooden cabin in soft pale bands, slipping through the cracks of the window frame and settling gently over the man lying near the hearth, where Emily Carter remained seated, her posture still but her attention fully awake as she watched the subtle shift in his breathing deepen and stabilize, as though the night itself had finally decided to release its grip on him. The fire had burned lower now, reduced to glowing embers that cast a warm amber hue across the room, and in that quiet transition between night and day, Emily felt an unusual stillness in her chest, the kind that came only when uncertainty had not yet turned into danger or clarity. The man stirred again, this time more deliberately, his fingers curling slightly against the rough wool blanket beneath him, and his eyelids opened with visible effort, revealing eyes that reflected the faint light like polished silver disturbed by storm clouds. For a moment, he did not speak, only looked at her with an expression that carried both confusion and a depth of awareness that seemed far too sharp for someone who had been unconscious just hours earlier. Emily leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice calm and steady as she spoke. "You are safe here. You are in my cabin near Blackwood Ridge. The rain has stopped, and it is morning." Her words were slow and careful, as if she were speaking to someone who might retreat from the sound of reality itself. The man did not respond immediately, instead scanning the room with quiet precision, taking in every detail from the structure of the wooden beams to the position of the extinguished lantern, and Emily noticed the way his gaze paused briefly on her hands, as though assessing not just the space but her presence within it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and slightly strained, carrying the weight of exhaustion but also an underlying firmness that suggested something unshaken beneath the surface. "You brought me here." It was not a question, but Emily nodded anyway, her hands resting loosely in her lap. "You were by the river. I could not leave you there." A faint pause followed, and in that silence, something shifted between them, not visible but palpable, like the subtle change in air pressure before a storm. The man slowly attempted to sit up, stopping briefly as if testing his own strength, and Emily instinctively moved closer, ready to steady him if needed, though he did not require assistance, regaining a controlled seated position with measured patience. Outside, a distant bird called from the forest line, sharp and clear, reminding Emily that the world beyond this cabin continued unchanged. Yet somehow everything inside felt altered, as though this encounter had rewritten an invisible balance. The man's gaze returned to her, lingering this time with a focus that felt intentional rather than wandering, and after a long moment he asked quietly, "Why would you risk bringing a stranger into your home?" Emily hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because you were still alive." Something unreadable passed across his expression at that response, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or something deeper, quickly concealed beneath composure. The fire finally gave a soft crackle as the last of its warmth shifted, and in that sound the space between them seemed to settle into a fragile understanding, neither fully trust nor suspicion, but a suspended moment where neither knew what the next breath would reveal, and yet both remained still enough to find out. The silence inside the cabin lingered longer than either of them seemed willing to break, stretching through the fading warmth of the hearth as Emily Carter slowly rose to retrieve a small kettle from the wooden shelf, her movements calm and deliberate, as if routine could anchor the strange tension that now filled the room. Outside the window, the morning light had grown brighter, revealing mist still clinging to the trees of Blackwood Ridge like a thin veil that refused to fully lift, and the world beyond the cabin felt distant, almost unreal, compared to the quiet intensity forming within these four walls. The man watched her carefully, his posture now more stable, though still restrained by exhaustion, and there was a subtle alertness in the way his eyes tracked her every movement, as though he were trying to reconstruct not just where he was, but how he had come to exist in this moment at all. Emily poured water into a small cup and set it near him without speaking, then moved to gather a few dried herbs from a hanging bundle, crushing them gently between her fingers before dropping them into the warm liquid, the scent rising faintly through the air, grounding and familiar. When she turned back, she found him already observing the herbs with quiet focus, and for the first time, she noticed something unusual in the way he reacted to even the smallest details, as if his awareness extended beyond ordinary perception. "You are careful," he said after a moment, his voice steadier now, the strain from earlier reduced to a controlled calm, and Emily offered a faint nod as she replied, "You needed stability more than questions." That answer seemed to settle something within him, though he did not fully relax, instead shifting his gaze toward the window where the forest line stood still and watchful. A distant gust of wind moved through the trees, and with it came a subtle change in the atmosphere that Emily could not immediately explain, like a pressure shift in the air that made the cabin feel momentarily smaller, more contained. The man's expression changed almost imperceptibly at the same time, his attention sharpening as though he had sensed the same invisible disturbance, and Emily noticed his fingers flex slightly against the blanket, controlled but intentional, as if responding to something beyond the physical space. She hesitated before speaking again, choosing her words carefully. "Do you remember your name?" The question hung in the air, and for a brief moment, his eyes lowered as though searching a place deep within himself that was not easily accessible, before he finally answered, "Names are complicated." It was not a refusal, but it was not a confirmation either, and that ambiguity deepened the quiet mystery surrounding him. Emily studied him for a long moment, sensing that whatever he was not simply a traveler or a lost wanderer, yet she also felt no immediate threat, only an unfamiliar weight of presence that seemed to fill the space between each breath. Outside, the forest birds grew suddenly silent, a shift so abrupt that Emily instinctively turned toward the window, noticing how even the wind had eased, leaving an unnatural stillness settling over the trees. When she looked back, the man was already watching her again, and in his gaze there was something steadier now, something almost reflective, as though he were beginning to recognize not only her, but the significance of where he had ended up. And in that shared awareness, the air between them tightened into a quiet understanding that neither of them yet had the language to explain. The morning had fully settled over Blackwood Ridge, yet the cabin felt unchanged in its strange suspension of quiet, as if the world outside had decided to pause its usual rhythm just beyond the threshold of the wooden door, leaving Emily Carter and the man she had brought in a space that felt separated from time itself. Emily had begun organizing the small interior out of habit, placing dried herbs into neat bundles and checking the water basin near the hearth, but her attention repeatedly returned to him, to the way he now sat with more control in his posture, as if each passing minute was restoring something carefully hidden rather than simply healing what was broken. He observed her movements without interruption, and there was a growing awareness in his gaze that suggested he was no longer just trying to understand where he was, but also trying to understand her. Emily noticed the subtle change in his breathing, more measured now, less fragmented, and when she placed a small bowl of warm broth on the table beside him, He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement rather than hesitation, as though accepting assistance was a decision he had weighed carefully. "You are not afraid of me," he said at last, his voice calmer than before, but still carrying an edge of quiet observation, and Emily paused for a moment before answering honestly. "If I were afraid, I would not have brought you inside my home." The words seemed to settle between them, not as agreement, but as recognition of a boundary neither had crossed. Outside the cabin, the forest had grown unusually still again, the birds that had returned briefly now silent once more, and even the wind seemed hesitant, as if the air itself was waiting for something unseen to arrive. The man turned his gaze toward the window, his expression tightening slightly, not in fear, but in alert recognition, and Emily followed his line of sight, though she saw nothing beyond the trees and pale morning mist. Yet she felt it too, a subtle pressure in the atmosphere, like the moment before a distant storm reaches the horizon. "Do you feel that?" she asked quietly, though she could not define what that truly was, and he did not answer immediately, only narrowing his eyes as though listening to something beyond human perception. A long silence followed, one that carried more weight than conversation, until he finally spoke. "This place is not as quiet as it appears." Emily turned back to him, studying his face more closely now, noticing how his composure seemed increasingly deliberate, as if he were holding himself in place rather than simply resting. She wondered who he truly was, why even unconscious he had carried an impression of something far greater than circumstance alone could explain, and why the forest outside seemed to respond to his presence with such unusual restraint. As she considered these questions, a faint vibration passed through the wooden floor beneath them, subtle enough that it might have been mistaken for shifting wind against the foundation, yet both of them noticed it at the same time. The man's hand tightened briefly against the edge of the table before relaxing again, controlled but intentional, and Emily felt an instinctive awareness rising within her that whatever connection had begun forming in silence was no longer simply about shelter or survival, but about something far more uncertain, something that had not yet revealed its true shape. While beyond the cabin the forest held its breath as if waiting for an answer that had not yet been spoken. The cabin had grown quieter again, but it was not the same kind of silence that had filled the early morning hours, because now it felt heavier, more aware, as if the air itself had adjusted to the presence of something that did not fully belong to the world around it. Emily Carter stood near the small wooden table, her hands resting lightly on its edge as she tried to steady her thoughts, though her attention kept drifting back to the man seated near the hearth, whose stillness no longer resembled exhaustion alone, but something closer to restrained awareness, like a surface calm hiding a deeper current beneath. The faint sound of shifting wind outside brushed against the cabin walls, yet even that movement felt distant, as though the forest had begun to circle rather than pass by. The man slowly lifted his gaze toward her again, and this time there was no confusion in his expression, only a quiet intensity that suggested he had begun to piece together more than just his surroundings. Emily felt that shift immediately, an unspoken recognition that whatever had been dormant within him was no longer fully asleep, even if it had not yet fully revealed itself. "You should not be here alone," he said suddenly, his tone steady but carrying a weight that made the words feel less like advice and more like certainty. And Emily frowned slightly, crossing her arms in a calm but cautious response. "I have lived here long enough to manage on my own." A brief pause followed, and for the first time, a faint trace of something almost like restrained concern appeared in his eyes, though it vanished quickly as he looked away toward the window again. The forest beyond the glass had begun to shift in subtle ways, shadows moving where no wind could justify their motion, and Emily felt it too. That same invisible pressure that had been building since morning now deepening into something harder to ignore. She took a slow step closer to the window, her reflection faint against the glass, and asked quietly, "What exactly are you afraid of?" The question hung between them, and when he finally answered, his voice lowered slightly as though speaking too clearly might disturb something unseen. "Not fear. Awareness." Emily turned back to him, studying him more carefully now, noticing how his posture remained controlled even as tension subtly gathered in his presence, like a held breath waiting for release. The fire behind him flickered, and for a moment the light shifted in a way that made his shadow appear larger than it should have been, stretching across the floorboards with an unnatural stillness. Outside, a distant sound echoed through the trees, too faint to identify, but enough to make the air in the cabin feel suddenly thinner. Emily felt her pulse steady rather than quicken, not from courage or fear, but from the growing realization that whatever she had brought into her home was not simply a wounded stranger recovering from misfortune, but something far more significant that the world itself seemed to recognize before she had words to define it. The man slowly exhaled, his gaze fixed now on the horizon beyond the trees, and in that moment, the stillness between them tightened into a fragile balance, as if the cabin, the forest, and everything beyond had quietly agreed that what came next would no longer remain hidden. The stillness inside the cabin had become almost unbearable, not because it was empty, but because it felt occupied by something unseen, something that no longer belonged only to Emily Carter or the wounded man she had taken in, but to the space between them and beyond them, as if the entire forest outside had pressed itself closer to listen. Emily stood near the window now, her reflection faint against the pale morning light, her eyes scanning the tree line, where nothing moved, yet everything felt awake in a way that could not be explained by ordinary weather or shifting wind. Behind her, the man slowly rose from his seated position near the hearth, not abruptly, but with a controlled and deliberate motion that revealed more strength than he had shown before, as if each passing hour had restored not only his body, but something deeper and more fundamental. Emily turned slightly at the sound of his movement, watching as he steadied himself without assistance, his gaze still fixed outward, toward the forest, as though it were no longer simply land but a boundary holding back something significant. "You are not safe here," he said again, this time with more certainty, and Emily exhaled softly, her voice calm, but firm in response. "I have lived near these woods my entire life. I know what is safe and what is not." A faint pause followed, and for a brief moment, something like restrained disbelief crossed his expression, though it quickly dissolved back into composed focus. The air in the cabin seemed to tighten again, subtle but undeniable, as if pressure was building not around them but through them, and Emily noticed the firelight flicker in a pattern that no draft could justify. Outside, the forest had fallen into an unnatural silence, the kind that removed even the suggestion of birds or insects, leaving only the faintest sound of distant trees shifting as though responding to an unseen signal. The man took a slow step toward the window, stopping just short of standing beside her, his presence now closer, more defined, and Emily became aware of how the space around him seemed to change, as if reality itself adjusted its focus whenever he moved. "Something is coming," he said quietly, not as warning, but as acknowledgement, and Emily's brow tightened slightly as she followed his gaze into the trees, seeing only mist and pale light, yet feeling an undeniable weight settle in her chest. She asked, "What do you mean by coming?" But he did not answer immediately, his attention locked on the horizon where the forest met the sky, as though waiting for a signal only he could perceive. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice lower, almost measured. "This place has been marked by awareness that is not human." The words should have sounded impossible, yet the way he said them made them feel less like speculation and more like recognition of something already in motion. Emily felt a quiet tension rise within her, not fear, but something closer to understanding forming too slowly to take shape, and when she looked back toward him, she noticed the faintest shift in his expression, as though the weight he had been carrying since she found him was no longer just about survival, but about identity. And in that silent realization, the cabin seemed to hold its breath even more tightly than before, as if waiting for the moment when whatever had been hidden would no longer remain. So, the cabin no longer felt like a shelter from the world outside, but rather like a thin boundary holding back something vast and deliberate, as if every wooden plank and cracked window frame had begun to recognize that whatever stood within it was no longer isolated from what waited beyond the trees. Emily Carter remained near the window, her hands resting lightly on the sill as she studied the forest beyond the glass, where the mist now moved in slow, unnatural patterns that seemed less like weather and more like intention. Behind her, the man had gone still again, But it was no longer the stillness of recovery or exhaustion. It was something sharper, more focused, as if every sense he possessed had extended outward beyond the cabin walls. Emily turned slightly, noticing how his gaze remained locked on the horizon, his expression no longer uncertain but quietly resolved. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that had not been there before. "It is closer than I expected." The words were simple, but they shifted the air between them in a way that made Emily's attention sharpen instantly. She stepped away from the window, facing him fully now, her tone measured but direct. "What is closer?" A long pause followed, one that felt heavier than the silence before it. And for the first time, he did not seem to be searching for language, but rather choosing what truth could safely be spoken. "What follows me?" he said at last, and Emily felt a subtle tension rise in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the instinctive awareness that whatever he meant carried consequences beyond this room. Outside, the forest responded as if acknowledging his words, the mist shifting in a slow ripple that moved across the tree line like a silent wave. Emily took a careful step closer, her voice steady but quieter now. "You need to explain what you were talking about." He finally turned toward her fully, and in that moment she saw something in his expression that had not been there before, not confusion or uncertainty, but recognition of a truth he had not yet shared. "I am not supposed to be found like this," he said, each word deliberate, as though he were reconstructing himself through speech. "Not in this state, not outside the boundaries that were meant to contain me." Emily studied him closely, her instincts trying to reconcile the calm man before her with the shifting pressure she felt in the air, and she realized that the space around him seemed subtly different, as if the cabin itself adjusted to his presence in ways that were not physical but perceptible nonetheless. The fire in the hearth flickered again, though no wind had entered, and the shadows along the walls elongated briefly before settling back into place. Emily asked, "Contain you from what?" And for a moment he did not answer, his gaze drifting toward the window once more where the forest stood unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but firm, from being recognized. The answer left a weight in the air that neither of them moved to immediately break, and Emily felt a shift in understanding forming slowly, like something just beneath the surface of awareness beginning to surface without yet revealing its full shape. Outside, the mist thickened again between the trees, and the boundary between forest and sky seemed to blur, while inside the cabin both of them remained still, aware that whatever was approaching was not simply movement through space, but something that had already begun to change the rules of the world they thought they understood. The first golden light of dawn finally spilled across the forest outside, seeping through the mist and brushing against the cabin walls in soft, warm strokes, and Emily Carter felt it as a shift in the air itself, a gentle awakening that carried the promise of clarity after a night weighed with uncertainty and quiet tension. The man who had remained so still throughout the early hours now rose fully to his feet, stretching carefully as though testing muscles and senses long dormant, and Emily watched him, noticing for the first time the subtle breadth of his shoulders, the calm authority in the way he carried himself despite the fragility she had first observed. He turned toward her slowly, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that felt like it could reach into the deepest parts of thought, and he spoke with a quiet assurance that carried weight beyond the ordinary. "I remember now, everything I was meant to be." Emily felt a shiver of understanding run through her, not fear, but awe, as if the cabin itself acknowledged the truth of his words. Outside, the forest seemed to respond, the mist parting gradually to reveal sunlight glinting against the dew-laden leaves, and the world felt larger, alive, as though holding its breath to witness the moment of emergence. The man stepped closer, and Emily could see the subtle shimmer of energy surrounding him, a faint glow that hinted at power restrained only by circumstance and awareness. And she realized that the stillness that had dominated the night had been a prelude to this precise moment of recognition and presence. He extended a hand toward her, not as a request, but as an assertion, a silent invitation that carried with it the weight of trust and inevitability, and Emily, her heart steady and her instincts aligned, placed her hand gently in his, feeling the warmth and the quiet pulse that spoke of something more than simple human connection. "You have saved more than my body," he said softly, his voice carrying the richness of realization and respect. "You have saved a path I thought lost." Emily met his gaze fully now, seeing in his eyes a reflection of every caution, every choice, and every moment of care she had offered. And in that reflection, she understood that the bond between them was no longer accidental, but purposeful, woven through shared presence and unwavering attention. The light of dawn crept fully into the cabin, illuminating both of them in a way that made shadows retreat and every detail clear, from the way his hands moved with deliberate care to the soft glint in her eyes that mirrored recognition and relief. A breeze moved through the cabin now, gentle and insistent, as if the forest itself had pushed aside the last remnants of night to witness what had been restored and revealed. He released her hand briefly, stepping back just enough to allow her to see him fully, and she noticed in his posture the same calm authority she had glimpsed earlier, but now balanced with a softness born from trust and awakening. "The world beyond this cabin awaits," he said, a statement not of demand but of shared anticipation, and Emily nodded, understanding instinctively that what had begun in secrecy and quiet would now continue in full awareness, and that the bond formed in the hours of storm and stillness had shifted everything, aligning both their fates with a clarity and purpose as unmistakable as the first light spilling through the forest and into their lives.